They left my daughter in the dark. 5 days later, I walked into their party. The kitchen light was off. That is the detail that stays with me. Not the note. Not the cold rice. The fact that my 7-year-old daughter had not turned the kitchen light on. And I stood in the doorway for a moment trying to understand why, and then I understood. She had been sitting in the dark long enough that it had stopped feeling like the dark. It had just become the room she was in. Zoe was at the table, with a bowl in front of her, and a spoon in her hand, and the particular stillness of a child who has been alone for a while, and has made her peace with it. She looked up when I came in, and her face did the thing it always does when she sees me, that immediate, uncomplicated opening like a window. She said, "Hi, Mama," in the voice she uses when she is trying to sound fine. I turned the light on. I put my bag down. I sat across from her and looked at the bowl. Cold rice and the leftover vegetables from 2 nights ago, the ones I had made on Wednesday, and stored in the container on the second shelf. She had served herself. She had found a spoon. She had sat down in the dark and eaten, because she was hungry, and there was no one to do it for her. I asked her how long she had been home. She thought about it with the seriousness she brings to questions she wants to answer accurately. She said she thought maybe since 4. I looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 7:40. I did not ask where Patricia was. I already knew Patricia was not there. What I did not know yet was the note. I saw it when I stood up to get her a glass of water. A folded piece of paper on the counter, next to the fruit bowl, with my name written on the outside in Patricia's handwriting, which is the careful, slightly formal script of a woman who was taught that presentation matters more than content. I opened it. "Maya, we've gone to the Hendersons for the evening. The party ran later than expected, so we went straight from the afternoon. Your daughter stayed home. We don't introduce that kind of child to our guests. There's rice in the fridge." I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it the first time. I understood it exactly the first time. I read it twice because some things require a second reading before the body decides what to do with them, before it decides whether this is the kind of thing that produces tears or the kind that produces something colder and more durable. I folded the note, put it in my pocket, poured Zoe her water, sat back down. She was watching me with those eyes she has, Daniel's shape but my depth, which is a combination that sees more than either of us intended to give her. She said, "Are you okay, Mama?" 7 years old, sitting in a dark kitchen eating cold rice alone for 3.5 hours, asking me if I was okay. I said I was fine. I asked her about her day. She told me about a book she had been reading. Something about a fox who builds a house, and I listened to every word with my whole attention, the way I always try to do when she talks, because children know when you're half present, and Zoe in particular has always known. And tonight of all nights, I wanted her to feel the full weight of being seen. After a while, she got quiet. She stirred the last of the rice in the bowl, and then she said, not looking at me, looking at the bowl, "Grandma said I have a different kind of face." I put my spoon down. When did she say that? When I asked if I could come to the party. She looked up. She said some gatherings are for people who look a certain way, and I have a different kind of face, and I wouldn't be comfortable. She paused. I don't think that's true. I'm comfortable at most places. I looked at my daughter. Her face, which is beautiful, which is a combination of my brown skin and Daniel's features, and something entirely her own that belongs to no one's family and every family. And I thought about Patricia saying those words to her, about Zoe processing them with that 7-year-old seriousness, trying to determine if they were accurate, concluding that she was probably comfortable at most places. The grace of children is something that should stop us cold more often than it does. I said, "You have the best face I have ever seen." She considered this. Then she said, "You're my mom though. You have to say that." "I don't have to say anything. I choose to say it because it's true." She thought about this for a moment and then nodded, accepting it with the quiet dignity she brings to most things, and went back to her rice. I sat with her until she was done. I washed the bowl. I took her upstairs and ran her bath and sat on the edge of the tub while she splashed and talked about the fox's house, which apparently had 3 rooms and a garden. I tucked her in. I read 2 chapters of the next book she had chosen. I turned off her light and stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her breathe. Then, I went back downstairs. I took the note out of my pocket. I set it on the kitchen table, under the salt shaker, so it wouldn't move. And I sat in the same chair where my daughter had eaten alone in the dark. In the kitchen of the house that I paid the mortgage on, after the party that my account had catered, and I was very still for a long time. I did not call Daniel. He was still at the party, or on his way home from it, and I had nothing to say to him yet. That would come out the right way. There is a version of this conversation that is all heat and justification and raised voices, and the specific chaos of a fight that resolves nothing. And that version does not help Zoe. It does not help anyone. I thought about something my own mother used to say. She said that the most dangerous person in any situation is not the one who loses their temper. It is the one who doesn't. I was not going to lose my temper. I had other plans. Daniel came home at 10. He was in the easy mood of a man who has had a pleasant evening and expects to find his household as he left it. He came into the kitchen and saw me at the table and registered something in my face that made him stop. He said, "Hey, you're home. How was the shift?" I said, "Long." He opened the refrigerator. I said, he was moving with the slightly careful energy of someone who has sensed a change in atmosphere, but has not yet decided whether to acknowledge it or wait for it to resolve on its own. This was Daniel's default approach to tension. Not avoidance exactly, more like the optimism of a man who believed most things settled themselves, if you gave them enough time. He had been giving things enough time for 2 years. They had not settled, he said. "Did Zoe go down okay?" "She did. Mom said she was a little tired earlier." I looked at him. "Did your mother tell you why Zoe was tired?" Something shifted in his face. He closed the refrigerator. "What do you mean?" I picked up the note from under the salt shaker and held it out to him without saying anything else. He took it. He read it. I watched his face while he read it. The way you watch a face when you need to know something true about a person before they have had time to compose a response. What I saw was not shock. That was the thing that mattered. It was not the face of a man encountering something he had no framework for. It was the face of a man encountering confirmation of something he had been choosing not to look at directly, or put the note down. He said, "Maya, Zoe was in this kitchen in the dark at 7:40 eating cold rice that she served herself. She has been home since 4. She told me your mother said she has a different kind of face." He was quiet. "Say something, Daniel," he said. "I'll talk to her." 3 words. The 3 Zord he had been saying for 2 years, in varying arrangements, about varying incidents, each one smaller than it should have been on its own and enormous in accumulation. I looked at him for a long moment, then I said, "Okay. Just that." And I went upstairs. He had expected more. He had braced for more. I could see it in the slight tension that ran out of his shoulders when I simply stood and left. He had expected the fight, and instead gotten the quiet, and the quiet is always harder to hold. Let him hold it. I had 5 days. I want to tell you something about the particular kind of pain that comes from watching your child be excluded. It is not clean like anger. It is not simple like sadness. It is a compound thing, layered and strange. Because it reaches backward through time, back to every moment you yourself were made to feel like an outsider. And it reaches forward too, into every future moment. Your child will carry this in ways neither of you can fully predict. Zoe did not mention the party again. This is the thing about children who have been hurt by adults they are supposed to trust. They often don't mention it again. They fold it somewhere small and quiet inside themselves and go back to talking about foxes and their 3-room houses, and you watch them do it. And you understand that what looks like resilience is sometimes just a 7-year-old doing the only thing available to her. I could not undo what Patricia had said. I could not give Zoe back those 3.5 hours in the dark kitchen. What I could do was make sure that the world my daughter grew up in was arranged honestly around what she was worth. So I made a list. I am an ICU nurse. I have worked double shifts and night shifts and holiday shifts for 4 years in a hospital where the stakes are not abstract. I am good at my job, in the way that people are good at jobs that require them to think clearly, under conditions designed to prevent clear thinking. I am organized, and I do not panic, and I understand that the difference between a good outcome and a bad one is almost always preparation. I brought that version of myself home for 5 days. I pulled 2 years of bank records. Our joint account, which I contributed 70% of, because Daniel's job at the architecture firm was junior, and the salary reflected it, while my nursing income was consistent and solid. From that account, the mortgage on the house where Patricia and Gerald had been staying in the spare room for 8 months, since Gerald's back surgery made their apartment stairs difficult. The grocery bills, which had tripled since they moved in. The utilities. The car insurance, which now covered Gerald's vehicle because his own policy had lapsed, and I had quietly extended hours rather than let him drive uninsured. And the party. The Hendersons' party, which Patricia had offered to help organize, and had mentioned casually 3 weeks ago that she was short for the catering deposit, and I had transferred $800 from my personal account. Not the joint account, my personal account, without being asked twice. $800 to cater an event from which my daughter was excluded for having a different kind of face. I printed everything. I did not organize it dramatically. I organized it the way I organize a patient chart, clearly, chronologically, with the facts in the right order so that anyone reading it would arrive at the same conclusion I had. Then I put it in a folder and I called Simone. Simone has been my best friend since nursing school. She is the kind of person who, when you call her and say you need to talk, says nothing except what time and where, and then she arrives 5 minutes early and orders coffee for both of you, because she already knows what you take. I told her everything, the note, Zoe in the dark, the different kind of face, the 2 years of quiet accumulation, the $800. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" I said, "Patricia is hosting Sunday lunch. Her real circle, the people whose opinion she actually cares about." Simone looked at me. "You weren't invited." "No. Are you going?" "Yes." She picked up her coffee. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing for Sunday. Before Sunday, I need you to tell me honestly if I'm doing this right, or if I'm doing this angry." I said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because Simone knows the difference between those two things and has never told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. She said, "You're not angry, you're clear." Those feel similar from the inside, but they look completely different from the outside. She paused. Don't lose the clarity. I said I wouldn't. I didn't. The 5 days had a texture I want to describe, because I think it matters. I was present. More present than I had been in months, maybe, because I was no longer spending energy on the low-level management of walking carefully around Patricia's preferences and Gerald's comfort, and Daniel's need to believe his family was basically good people behaving in basically understandable ways. I had put that weight down, and I could feel the difference in my body. I cooked dinner every night. I helped Zoe with her reading. I sat with her in the evenings, and we worked on a puzzle together, a map of the world that she had gotten for her birthday, and that we had been assembling slowly in pieces. She was learning where things were. She put her finger on the continent I was born from and said, "That's where part of you comes from," with the matter-of-fact pride of a child who finds geography thrilling. "And part of me," I said. She looked at this very seriously. "And part of me," she agreed. That is the thing Patricia had called a different kind of face. That is what she had left alone in the dark. Daniel tried, during those 5 days, to open conversations that I gently and consistently closed. Not because I was punishing him. That is not what those days were for, but because I did not have anything to say to him yet that was fully formed, and I have learned that half-formed things, said in the wrong moment, become the wrong things. I was waiting for Sunday, everything I needed to say to Daniel. I was going to say in the room, where it could not be quietly absorbed and filed, and managed into something smaller than it was. He knew something was coming. He is not an unperceptive man. He is just a man who has spent a long time hoping that perception is the same as action. It isn't. But he was about to learn that. Saturday night, I laid out what I was going to wear. I stood at her door and watched her sleep the way I had watched her sleep since she was born, with the feeling that has no real word in English, that compound of love and terror, and responsibility and wonder that parenthood installs in you permanently. The thing that makes you understand for the first time what it means to have something to lose. She had a different kind of face. She had the best face in any room she had ever been in. Tomorrow, they were going to understand exactly what kind of woman had been quietly holding their world together, and exactly what happened when that woman put the folder on the table. Patricia's Sunday lunches were performances. I do not mean this entirely as a criticism. There is something human about wanting to arrange the world around you so that it reflects the version of yourself you find most bearable. Patricia had been doing this her whole life. The right tablecloth, the right guests, the right conversation moving at the right pace. Everything calibrated to produce the feeling of a life well lived and well curated. I understood the impulse even as I understood how much damage it had done. The Hendersons were there. The Alcotts. Patricia's friend Margaret, who I had met twice, and who had the particular quality of certain women of a certain generation. Elegant, observant, and far more aware of what was actually happening in any given room than she ever let on. Daniel was there. He had mentioned the lunch on Friday, and I had nodded and said nothing. And he had looked at me with the expression he had been wearing for 5 days, the one that was trying to read something written in a language he was only beginning to recognize. I arrived 20 minutes after it started. Patricia opened the door and the performance held for exactly 1 second before something moved behind her eyes. She smiled. She said, "Maya, what a surprise," in the tone of someone who means the opposite but has too many witnesses to say so. I held out the flowers I had brought, white tulips, because they were her favorite. And I had always known her favorite, and had always brought them, and probably always would, because that is the kind of person I am even now, even today. She took them. I walked in. The room adjusted to my presence the way rooms do when something unexpected has entered them. Not hostility, not warmth, just the slight recalibration of people deciding how to arrange themselves relative to a new element. Gerald nodded from his chair. The Hendersons smiled. Margaret, from the corner, looked at me with those sharp, quiet eyes, and something in her expression said she was not surprised. I was here. I sat down. Daniel found my eyes across the room. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked away. Not unkindly, just with the steadiness of someone who has a timeline and is on it. The lunch was served. The conversation moved in its usual channels. Patricia hosted with the ease of long practice, drawing people in, steering topics, making everyone feel that being in her home was a particular kind of privilege. She was good at it. I had always acknowledged that, even privately, even now. We were halfway through the main course when Claire arrived. Daniel's sister was 40 minutes late, which was not unusual for Claire, and she came in with the slightly breathless energy of someone who has been in an argument with herself on the drive over about whether to come at all. She greeted the room. She sat down. She looked at me, and something crossed her face. Not guilt exactly, but its first cousin. I looked back at her steadily. She picked up her fork and put it down again. Patricia was telling the Hendersons something about the garden when Claire said, without particularly planning to, the way things come out when they have been held too long. How's Zoe? The table did not stop, but it slowed. Patricia continued her sentence about the garden to its end. And then there was a small pause and she said, "She's fine, I'm sure," the light dismissiveness of someone changing a channel. Claire said, "She was alone for a long time on Friday." The channel did not change. Patricia said, "She was perfectly comfortable at home." Claire set her fork down. She looked at her plate. She was 35 years old. She had spent 35 years in the gravitational pull of her mother's certainty, and I watched her decide, in the space of about 4 seconds, to step out of it. She said, "Mom." She was 7 years old, and she was alone in a dark house for almost 4 hours, because we decided she wasn't the right kind of child to bring to a party. The table was quiet. Margaret, in the corner, was very still in the way of someone who is listening with complete attention and has no intention of looking like it. Patricia said, with measured composure, "Claire, this isn't the time." "When is the time?" Claire's voice was not raised. It was something quieter and harder than raised. "I've been thinking about it since Friday. I sat at that party. And I knew Zoe was at home, and I didn't say anything, and I've been thinking about it since Friday." She looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry, Maya. I should have said something at the time." I looked at her. I know. 2 words, not forgiving and not withholding forgiveness, just acknowledging the truth of what she had said, which was the most honest thing that had happened in this family in a long time. Patricia said, "Maya, I hope you understand that our family gatherings." I reached into the bag beside my chair. I placed the folder on the table. I did not open it dramatically. I did not make a speech. I simply placed it between the tulips. Patricia had put in a vase at the center of the table, and the bread basket that had been there since we sat down, and I folded my hands and I looked at Patricia with the clearest expression I had. I said, "This is 2 years of bank records. The mortgage on this house, groceries, utilities, Gerald's car insurance." I paused. "And the catering deposit for Friday's party, $800 from my personal account." The room was completely still. Gerald looked at the folder. The Hendersons looked at Patricia. Margaret looked at me with those quiet eyes, and I thought I saw something in them that might have been recognition. The look of a woman who has been watching this particular dynamic for some time, and has been waiting for this particular moment. Patricia said, "This is not inappropriate. My daughter was in a dark kitchen eating cold rice that she served herself because nobody turned the light on for her. My voice was even. Not cold, not hot. Even. The way I am, even when I am standing next to a bed in the ICU, and the situation requires me to be the steadiest person in the room. And the note you left said she was not the right kind of child for your guests. I need everyone at this table to know that. Not because I want to embarrass you. Because the people in your life who think well of you deserve to think well of you with accurate information." Silence. Then Daniel said my name. He said it quietly, from across the table, and I turned to look at him. And his face was the face I had been waiting for. Not the managed face, not the keeping, the peace face, but the one underneath. The one I had fallen in love with 8 years ago, which was the face of a man who was genuinely feeling something and not trying to redirect it. He said, "I didn't know she was alone that long. I know you didn't, I should have." He stopped. Started again. "I should have made sure. Before I went to the party I should have made sure she wasn't alone. Yes. That's on me, not just on my mother. That's on me." Something shifted in the room at that, not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The particular atmosphere of a space where an honest thing has been said that cannot be taken back, and everyone is adjusting to what it means. Patricia said, with the last of her composure, "Daniel, you don't need to." "Mom." He looked at her, just looked. With the clarity of a man who has finally found the line and is standing on his side of it. "Stop." She stopped. It was, I thought, possibly the first time in his life he had said that word to her and meant it with his whole self, and not immediately softened it with something else. Margaret, from the corner, picked up her glass and took a small sip and said nothing. But she nodded, very slightly, and I was not sure anyone else saw it, but I did. Patricia did not apologize. I want to be honest about this, because stories like mine are often tidied at the end in ways that real life declines to be. She did not have a revelation at the table. She did not weep and reach for Zoe's name, and understand in a sudden flood of clarity what she had done. She composed herself. She thanked her guests. She moved the lunch forward, or said. She was gracious and controlled. And, somewhere behind that control, was something that I hoped was the beginning of a reckoning. But I could not know that, and it was not my job to wait for it. My job was what I had come here to do. I had come to say the thing where it could not be minimized. I had done that. I picked up my bag. I put the folder back in it. I stood, I said, "Thank you for having me," to the room, and I meant it without irony. Because gratitude for a stage is not the same as gratitude for what you found on it. I hugged Claire, briefly, because she had done something hard today, and hard things deserve acknowledgement. I walked out. The park near our house has a section with old oak trees that Zoe loves, because she says, the roots look like the trees are grabbing the ground on purpose. We had been there maybe an hour, she and I, sitting under the biggest one with the puzzle piece she had brought in her pocket. She carried pieces sometimes, individual ones she was looking forward to placing. When I heard footsteps on the path and looked up, Daniel. He had changed out of his lunch clothes into the jeans and the old gray sweater that he wears on days when he is not performing anything for anyone. He was walking toward us with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a man's who is not sure of his welcome, but has decided to show up anyway, which I recognized as possibly the bravest thing he had done in 2 years. Zoe saw him and said, "Daddy," with the simple uncomplicated love of a child who does not yet know how to portion it, and he came and sat next to her under the oak tree, and she showed him the puzzle piece, and explained which part of the world it belonged to. He listened with his whole face. Then he looked at me over her head. He did not say he was sorry. That would come later, in the right space, in the right words, in the slow, honest way that real apologies take shape when they are not performed for an audience. What he said, quietly enough that Zoe did not catch it under the sound of the wind in the oak leaves, was, "I see it now." I looked at him. "All of it," he said. "I see all of it." There is a particular thing that happens when someone you love says the true thing after a long time of not saying it. It does not fix what the silence built. It does not undo the dark kitchen or the cold rice or a 7-year-old deciding she was comfortable at most places. It doesn't reach back and change any of that. What it does is open a door. What you do with the door is a separate question. A longer one. Such a kind that takes a year or more to answer, and requires showing up every day with the same intention you showed up with the day before. Without the guarantee that it will be enough, just the willingness to try it anyway. I did not walk through the door that afternoon. But I did not close it either. I want to tell you what I understand now that I did not fully understand before that Friday. Patricia was not the problem. Patricia was a symptom of something older than her. Something taught and inherited and reinforced by a lifetime of people looking away at the right moment. The problem is what happens when the people who love you choose comfort over truth. Long enough that you begin to believe comfort and truth are the same thing. When silence becomes its own kind of endorsement. Daniel had been silent for 2 years. He had chosen the smoothest available path through every conflict, not because he was cruel. He was not cruel. But because no one had ever made the cost of that path visible to him. He had been allowed to believe that keeping the peace was the same as maintaining it. Zoe sitting in the dark was the cost, made visible. Finally, there are things that happen to children that they carry into adulthood, in ways neither they nor you will fully see for years. A 7-year-old told she has the wrong kind of face does not come home and collapse. She goes back to her Fox book. She asks if you're okay. She observes that she is comfortable at most places, and 20 years later something happens. A room that makes her feel small. A comment delivered with a smile. An exclusion dressed up as consideration. And she will not consciously remember the dark kitchen, but her body will. Her body will already know the shape of it. I know because I have a body too. I know what it keeps. What I wanted for Zoe. What I want, still, every day, is a world arranged honestly around her worth. Not a perfect world, just an honest one. One where the people who claim to love her are not permitted, without consequence, to look at her face and find it insufficient. That was what the folder on the table was about. Not money, though the money was real. Not revenge, though I will not pretend. There was nothing satisfying about the specific silence that fell over that room when I placed it there. It was about consequences, about the simple and radical idea that things have costs, and those costs belong to the people who incur them. Patricia had incurred a cost. Now she knew what it was. 3 weeks after the Sunday lunch, Patricia called me. It was a Tuesday evening, and Zoe was in the bath. And I was sitting on the kitchen counter, the way I do. When I am not quite ready to be a person who sits in chairs yet, and my phone buzzed, and her name was on it, and I looked at it for a moment. I answered. She talked for a while. Not an apology. I want to be accurate. Something adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged. In the language of a woman who has spent a lifetime in careful control of her own narrative, that the Friday had perhaps not been handled well, and that she understood. I had concerns. It was partial, and it was managed, and it was better than nothing. And worse than what Zoe deserved. When she finished, I said, "Patricia, I need you to say her name. Not my daughter, not the child. Her name. A long pause. Zoe, she said. Zoe has a beautiful face. I need you to know that. I need you to know that before we talk about anything else. Another pause, longer. Yes, Patricia said. She does. It was not everything. It was not close to everything. But it was the first true thing she had said to me in 2 years. And I sat with it, on the kitchen counter, and I decided it was a place to start. If she was willing to do the work that starting required. That was not a decision I would make for her. It was not a decision I would rush. Some things take the time they take. The oak tree in the park takes decades to make roots that look like they're grabbing the ground on purpose. You cannot speed up a root. You can only make sure the ground is worth holding on to. Zoe finished the puzzle on a Saturday 3 weeks later. She placed the last piece. A small blue section of the North Atlantic, which had been missing for 10 days and turned up under the couch. And she sat back and looked at the whole assembled map and said, with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something that took genuine effort, "There. Now I know where everything is." I sat beside her and looked at the world, spread out on the table. I said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it seriously the way she thinks about things that deserve a serious answer. She said, "Like things are in the right place." I put my arm around her. Outside the window, the afternoon was doing what afternoons do. Moving through its light without caring who was watching. Generous and indifferent in equal measure, the way the world is when it is simply being itself. Things in the right place. That is all I had ever wanted. For her, for us, for the house we lived in, and the people we let inside it. Not perfection. Not performance. Just things in the right place. We were getting there. Some people show you who they are in the big moments. Others show you in the small ones. In whether they turn the light on, in whether they say a child's name, in whether they stay or move toward the door. Pay attention to the small ones. They are never actually small.